Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 6th episode of Good Night and Good Luck, the Radio Bocconi program and podcast realized by the students of the 469 Television and Culture course in Bocconi University. I'm their teacher, Andrea Quarterone. We're back, almost 9 days after the election night, and for the moment we have two presidents. One is the actual one, Donald Trump, and the other one is the president-elect, Mr. Joe Biden, or President-elect Joe Biden. But this is usual in a U.S. election during the so-called transition in between the election and the first days of a new presidency. What usually is not is the fact that even if the numbers of the Biden's elections are pretty convincing, we are still waiting for the concession of President Trump. It's not frequent, this situation, but sometimes it happens. Like, for example, we'll all remember the 2000 election issue between Al Gore and George W. Bush that was, by the way, solved by the Supreme Court. So the main question we are asking ourselves is the same of the title of this episode. What happened? What is happening? And what's next? In the following hour, we'll discuss it. Before leaving the floor to Ennio Terrasi Borghesan, the teaching assistant of the course and the great playmaker of this program, let me say that from tomorrow on, this episode will be available on Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcast, as the previous ones, including last one, episode 5, that was the 8 hours long election night. And by the way, thank you for have followed us, for have attended the election night with us in place of attending the Key Commentana as well. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You just have to type Good Night and Good Luck 2020. So, for the moment, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ennio Terrasi Borghesan.
Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure for me as well as it has been for the previous 5 episodes to introduce everybody, every team, every group that has produced this week's episode. This week's episode is entirely concentrated in what happened since November 3rd election day, and the whole week that has passed by in determining actually what happened during the 2020 election in the United States. As of this moment, the victory of the election has been called by networks media for former Vice President Joe Biden. 2 states are still mostly uncalled by most networks. One is Arizona, that actually has been called by a few networks, such, for example, Fox News and the Associated Press, and Georgia, where the margin between Trump and Biden is by a little bit the 14,000 votes. And the Secretary of State of Georgia has already said that there will be a recount in the state, but it's highly unlikely that the recount will change the winner of the state that is projected to be Mr. Joe Biden. We're still learning about President Trump pretty baseless claims to cast some doubts on the actual ending of these elections and the actual result of these elections. As of tonight, we still don't have many Republicans elected officials recognizing the result of the presidential election, while mostly of them have recognized both the results of the Senate and the House elections. That has actually went pretty well for Republicans, because in the worst of case scenarios, the Senate will be a 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans, and Republicans have in fact closed by the gap in the House of Representatives. We will discuss this and more topics, all concentrated on the US election in these episodes. So I'll give the floor now to David from Team Biden. David will cover what has been the week for Mr. Biden, that is now actually the president-elect.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much. I think that you also have mentioned that the main question is what happened. Well, after the marathon, we went to bed. Biden had 223 electoral votes. Trump had 174. States that previously had an advantage for Trump started to turn blue once mail ballots started to be counted. Thus, Trump started losing Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. And as you mentioned, the margins in Georgia are so low, that the networks haven't called a victory yet. In other states like Arizona, the situation is inversed. Biden was the one that had an advantage, and Trump was the one that was narrowing the margin. On Saturday, the networks called for the victory of Biden, even if the counting hadn't ended, with some states even preparing for recounting. Biden has now 279 electoral votes in the more conservative estimations, like the one of BBC, that doesn't give him Georgia and Arizona. Biden is past the magic number of 270, and is expected to arrive at 300 seats with these two states. This would mean that the election will end with a margin of +2 compared with Trump results in 2016. But I think that another question we may have is, why has it taken so long to have the results? Because we were expecting to declare a winner on the marathon, and that wasn't the case. Well, first of all, there has been a huge increase in participation. We have, in fact, the best numbers in participation since 1900, and also a huge amount of mail-in ballots that come from the situation of the pandemic and that are very slow in the counting, and also have a huge variety depending on the state, because the laws of how to count them are different. Besides of these facts, the networks have been extremely careful when calling for the victory of a state because of the narrow margins they have. And speaking of which, we see that the most subtle changes in these elections have made a huge difference, because when compared to 2016, just 60 counties have turned blue, and with very narrow margins. Arizona, for example, has an advantage for Biden of 10,000 votes. And since these numbers are less than 1%, it is most likely that Republicans are going to call for recount of the votes. So how can we cope with this increase of participation and the results that haven't changed that much? Well, it is mainly because, in the case of Biden, he has improved the results of Hillary Clinton in 2016. The swing states this time were Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and most likely Arizona and Georgia will add to that list. And all of these states have turned blue. It is also worth mentioning the curious case of Ohio, because it is the first time that a candidate that won the state that is not elected as president since time of JFK 60 years ago. We will get into more detail about the keys to the victory of this election once the counting ends and when all information about exit polls is available, so stay tuned for future episodes. And as we mentioned, on Saturday, the networks called for the victory of now President-elect Biden. And on Saturday, we saw their victory speech. It started with Kamala Harris, the now Vice President-elect of the United States. She began by honoring late Congressman John Lewis, a civil rights activist, who died last year. She said, "Democracy is not a state, it's an act," quoting him. Harris is a history-making figure because she's the first woman, the first Black person, and the first South Asian to be elected as vice president. Harris spoke of what her win represented, saying, "While I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last." So she was talking to the next generation of women leaders, saying to every little girl watching that they now could see America as a country of possibilities. She, of course, thanked her husband, her children, and her family, and then remembered her mother, Shamala Gopalan Harris, who immigrated to the US from India as a young woman, and who could not have imagined this moment. But she believed in an America where these moments were possible. Harris also expressed her gratitude to Biden, who had the audacity to break down one of the most substantial barriers in the US, selecting a woman as vice president. She wore a white suit and not two suffragettes, 100 years after, women's constitutional right to vote was guaranteed. Tonight, I reflect on their struggle, and I stand on their shoulders, she said. During the campaign, Kamala and Joe often stressed out how important and fundamental our right to vote is, and Harris underlined this once again in her speech, thanking supporters for turning out the vote and for their activism throughout the 4 years of the Trump administration. She then left the floor for President-elect Joe Biden, who started his speech by thanking all the people who support him and helped him win the presidency. He thanked his wife, Jill Biden, and his family, saying that he would not be there without the support of Jill, his son Hunter, Ashley, her daughter, their grandchildren, the spouses, and other family. They were their heart. He obviously talked about his mate, Kamala Harris, saying, I will have the honor of serving with a fantastic vice president. He also thanked all the people who volunteered and worked in the polls in the middle of a pandemic, local elected officials, and the campaign team. I owe you everything, he said. He thanked all those who supported him and said he is proud of the coalition his ticket has been able to put together. That is the most diverse and broad in history. Democrats, Republicans, gay, straight, transgender, white, Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, all people is included. Biden continued his speech talking to every single American. He asked President Trump supporters to give him a chance and repeated his promise that he would seek to unite rather than divide. He underlined that he does so not thinking of blue states and red states, only in the United States. Biden noted that he sought the nation's highest office to rebuild the soul of America, rebuild the backbone of the nation, the middle class, and to make America respected around the world again. Biden talked with compassion, vulnerability, reminding people that he understands what losing elections feels like. In great contrast with a speech of Trump in 2016, in which he says, I always win, in everything. Losing is for losers, and I am definitely not a loser. Biden has lived lost several times during his life, and he knows losing. He knows it is part both of life and politics. According to the president-elect, it is in losing that you learn to appreciate the victory. Then he followed by stating, it's time to put away the harsh rhetoric, lower the temperature, see each other again, listen to each other again, and make progress. We have to stop treating our opponents our enemies. We are not enemies. We are Americans. And again, this is in opposition what we are used to hear with President Trump, because he described in 2019 Democrats as really evil people. President Trump has actively worked to create political division, but now Biden is trying to remind people how important it is to work together and find a common humanity and a sense of belonging. These words are of fundamental significance for people who have lived 4 years of a polarizing president. Biden used the weapon of empathy to reach to those citizens who neither vote him or support him. And in continuity with this philosophy of losing that Biden has, one of the very first things he did as president-elect, in this case, was to visit the graveyard of his son Bo, and a story that we covered in one of our previous episodes. And even if Biden hasn't sworn the charge yet, he is already moving. As we saw during the campaign, tackling the pandemic is one of the top priorities of his administration. So it wasn't a surprise to see the designation of a COVID-19 Transition Advisory Board, composed by 13 experts, that will ensure that every measure taken has a bedrock of science behind. The response to the composition of this board has been enthusiastic for mainly 2 reasons. The first one is that now people finally have a government that trusts science. The second one is that they don't only worry about health, because one of the co-chairs, Marcela Nunes-Smith, is an expert of health equity. So we can expect that the Biden administration will also take into account other aspects, such as gender, ethnicity, or income, when implementing the measures to tackle the COVID. And since Biden won't be president before January 2021, we can only make assumptions about his first move in charge, following the plans he presented during the campaign. Talking about the economy, he will revert Trump's corporate tax. Moreover, Biden heads into office planning to re-enter the US immediately into the Paris Climate Accord of 2015. About racial equity, Biden has pushed for the passage of laws to strengthen the Voting Rights Act. Biden has said that on his first day as president, he will produce comprehensive immigration legislation to give citizenship for millions of migrants living in the US. In general, he will reverse Trump's policies about immigration, including the construction of the US-Mexican border wall. And finally, Biden will enact comprehensive criminal justice reform. Again, these are just assumptions based on the campaign promises, and we'll have to wait and see. But for the moment on, we are already seeing the president moving.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your insight in what has been Joe Biden's week and reaction to his win as president-elect of the United States. Inauguration Day will be on January 20, 2021, and it's still unclear when and if Mr. Trump will concede actually the race. The Electoral College will ratify the result of the election in mid-December. But now let's move to Serenella and Rachele to give us a perspective of what has been the week actually for the president, Donald Trump.
Okay, thank you. So, on November 3rd, President Trump declared to have won the election, despite millions of votes to be counted, and pushed the stop the count. He lashed out, calling for fraud and claiming a legal win. Nonetheless, his claim was widely disproven, and no elected leader in a democracy has the right to unilaterally order votes to stop being counted.
On November 5th, Trump's team started launching a number of weak legal actions without offering any evidence of irregularities. President Trump himself tweeted to demand vote counting to continue in states where he is behind, such as Nevada and Arizona, and stop the count in states where the lead was narrowing and destined to vanish, such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He later held a press conference signaling that he had no intention of leaving power without a fight, further repeating his baseless claims of illegal votes being counted. This speech was held in the White House, was interrupted to be fact-checked by several TV channels like MSNBC, while it was carried in full by CNN and Fox News.
On November 6th, it appeared that Georgia, where Biden overtook the president in the vote count, is headed for an automatic recount. But it also appeared unlikely that Georgia's electoral votes were to be decisive for reaching 270 electoral votes for either candidates. After the 3 days of Twitter labeling his tweet as disputed and potentially misleading, the president also lashed out at the social network, saying that it was out of control.
On November 7th, Joe Biden is proclaimed president-elected by the projection of all news networks, as his lead in Pennsylvania is outside the margin that would trigger an automatic recount. The president, who was golfing at the time when the network called the race for Mr. Biden, released a statement in which he continued to claim that the elections are not over and that Mr. Biden wants to be identified as a winner in order to hide the truth to come to light. He furthermore insisted on the dubious and inexplicable concept of legal votes, anticipating for the following Monday a series of legal challenges to call for legal ballots to be counted instead of the illegal ones.
On November 8th, the first full day since Mr. Biden announced as the election winner, is also the 4-year anniversary of Mr. Trump win over Hillary Clinton in 2016. While President-elect Biden started to set up his transition team, Trump appointees refused to formally start the process and cast clouds of uncertainties. Few Republicans elected officials come on to recognize Biden's win and the status of president-elect.
On November the 9th, President Trump continued to avoid to be seen in public, while sticking to Twitter and to comment any talk shows seen on television. A major moment happens when he tweets the firing of Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, saying that he has been terminated. While the move was widely expected, based on reports dating back before November the 3rd, the consensus across the White House correspondence is that Esper will be just the first of many Trump appointees expecting to be fired. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell comes out of the record in an apparent support of the president's claims, stressing that the legal votes should be counted without recognizing Joe Biden as the president-elect. Attorney General Bill Barr, however, formally says that the Department of Justice can investigate eventual cases of voting irregularities should evidences emerge.
On November 10th, while President Trump continued in his social media rants, if possible with more rancorous sentiment after the Pfizer announcement of further and positive developments in the race for a COVID-19 vaccine, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo appears to joke on the record that there will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration, sparking outrage.
Yesterday, on November the 11th, was the first time Trump made a public appearance after the defeat in the 2020 presidential race. The president appeared with the Vice President Mike Pence at a memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia for Veterans Day, and did not deliver any remarks. But shortly before leaving for Arlington, he wrote a Twitter in which he stated that there have been claims of voter fraud in Philadelphia. In the meantime, he is still going ahead with the legal challenges contesting vote counting procedures in several states.
Thank you, Serenella. Thank you, Rachele, for your readout and your chronological story of what has been undoubtedly an historical week for President Trump and actually for the entire U.S. elections history. So far, only 4 Republican senators have congratulated Mr. Biden on his win and recognized Joe Biden as the president-elect. Little bit more recognition has occurred into the foreign affairs atmosphere. We will now move to Alessia from Foreign Affairs team. She will tell us what has been the reaction worldwide to Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 election.
Yes, thank you, Anu. So, in our last episode, we talked about the expectations of the various European and not European leaders and countries about the election's outcome. Today, we want to speak about how they reacted and how Biden's victory has changed their expectations for the future. First of all, an overview. So most world leaders rushed to congratulate Joe Biden, but Russia's President Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping, 2 likely losers from the defeat of Donald Trump, remained silent. Both Russia and China sent immediate congratulations to Trump in the 2016 election, but has so far refused to do so after last week's election. Regardless, Putin has previously stated that it was ready to work with any US leader to normalize the bilateral relation between Russia and the US, and the Chinese media say that Beijing is willing to communicate with the Biden administration and ease the relationship by reviving trade talks. Moreover, from our last episode, we mentioned that Russian President Vladimir Putin actually defended Trump, who has been impeached earlier this year for his pushes towards making Ukraine open a baseless corruption investigation into Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Moreover, the spokesman for Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, said that we think it appropriate to wait for the official vote count before congratulating anyone. As we know, the ties between the two nations sank to the lowest when Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014 during Biden's vice presidency under Barack Obama. China also held off on sending congratulations to Biden. The Trump administration has driven the US-China relationship to the lowest after imposing sanctions against Beijing and criticizing China's response to the global pandemic. The editor of the Global Times, Wu Xijin, tweeted that China needs to keep larger distance from the US presidential election to avoid getting entangled on its controversy. This actually shows that China respects the US as a whole. The president of the Maldives, on the other side, is thought to be the first to have congratulated Biden, tweeting his welcome within 24 minutes of the US networks announcing Biden's victory. It was the first of many leaders to send his congratulations worldwide. Iran, suffering from Trump's-inspired sanctions, celebrated Trump's defeat and said that the US should now compensate Iran for its mistakes. Iran's president, Hassan Rouhani, said he will wait to see what Biden does before deciding if there is any difference between Trump and his successor. On Saturday, the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, mocked the US election, saying it was an example of the ugly face of liberal democracy, which has shown the definite political, civil, and moral decline of the US regime. We know that tensions also spilled out from Turkey, with figures close to Erdogan warning Biden not to support Syrian Kurds or challenge Turkey's weather ambitions in the Middle East. The Turkey's Vice President, Fuat Oktay, said Trump's defeat would not change relations between the old allies. The channels of communication will work as before, but of course there will be a transition period, he said. As far as Israel leader is concerned, Benjamin Netanyahu, a close ally of Trump, sent Biden formal congratulations without naming president-elect. But Israel will want reassurances about the US maintaining pressure on Iran and its continued support for the normalizations of relations between Israel and Arab states. In Asia, most countries are looking for a continued thought line on China and also more detail on the balance between cooperation and confrontation with the world's rising superpower. Let's pass now to Europe, where the situation is the following. Angela Merkel affirmed that the transatlantic friendship is irreplaceable if we are to meet the great challenges of this time, while Macron said Europe and the US have a lot to do to overcome today's challenges. Let's work together. The European Council presidents, Charles Michel, listed COVID-19, multilateralism, climate change, and international trade as areas of future cooperation, while the European Union's foreign policy chief spoke of a great day for US and Europe, and of the need to rebuild our partnership. An important message comes from UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, a strong Trump ally, who issued one of the most hurtful messages of congratulations for President-elect Biden, generating such surprises into journalists worldwide. As of today, Joe Biden has already held official conversations as president-elect with the leaders of UK, Germany, France, and Ireland. In Italy, both Mattarella and Prime Minister Conte have expressed their best wishes for Mr. Biden, while there is no communication of any talks already happened between Italy and the future US administration. But what are going to be the immediate challenges for the new president? Biden's key foreign policy priorities are likely to be an offer to cooperate in the fight against coronavirus and the commitment to rejoin the UN Paris Climate Agreement on day one of his administration. We know that US formally left the agreement last week. The Biden team will also have to decide whether it is worth promising to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal that Trump deserted in 2016. Many Iran specialists are urging Biden to go for a quick win and lift sanctions in return for an Iranian commitment to abide by its commitments in the accord.
Thank you, Alessia. Thank you for your intervention and your general overview of what has been this week on the global stage. Undoubtedly, a great actor of this week, especially in what has been a whole waiting for the actual results of the election, have been the media. Both the what we call old media, such as networks, TV networks, radio and TVs, and social media. We will start from the traditional media and their coverage of the election. So now I'll give you the word to Julia and Joanna, who will give us a general compressed understanding of what has been the coverage of the main US networks. Julia will start with that, and Joanna then will lead also with the coverage of what has been also the coverage of President Trump's reaction to the election themselves.
So good evening to everyone.
Good afternoon.
So as you may have implied, media plays a key role in major events, such as the elections, due to the influence it has on the public. For this reason, we would like to share with you the kind of information that some of the most popular networks, such as CNN, NBC, and Fox News, have decided to convey and share with the public during the 4 non-stop days of coverage of the elections. So I'll start by talking about NBC. This network was actually able to reach more than 5.6 million of viewers on the election night, which was actually one of their highest figures ever, confirming the assumption that this year's election strongly concerned a huge part of the population. One of the strategies used by NBC in order to fill the gaps in between the 4 days of coverage was to cut into the candidates' speeches. They were very keen, especially on reporting Trump's one, as their main aim was actually to fact-check him, which actually demonstrates the main political lean of the network. While reporting Biden's speech instead, NBC emphasized and highlighted many times the candidate's national COVID strategy and how his victory could have led to a boost of the Obamacare Act. In fact, many reports from NBC were strongly focused on the alarming rise of COVID. The attention was mainly created by interviewing doctors, which appeared to be extremely negative on this aspect, but also ordinary people that were touched by COVID on a personal level. For example, victims, families, virologists, and so on. Another main focus of NBC during the coverage appeared to be Biden's new strategy to face social and racial injustice. And now I would like to report some words that were said from an NBC journalist. And he said, "With a nation divided, a pledge to push unity." NBC also reported live stream many celebrations of the US citizens around the country for the projected victory of Biden. However, the interesting fact is that NBC didn't just report the current situation of the streets, but they also interviewed random people celebrating or walking by, of which actually many of them were Black or immigrants, which makes us think that journalists might have not chosen people so much randomly, since they spent most of the time talking about Biden's plan to face social and racial injustice, but who knows. Also, after Trump's huge and baseless complaint on the assumption of vote counting corruption, NBC showed a report named "What the Polls Got Actually Wrong," which underlined that the Midwest and Florida were probably the toughest states to foresee, and the only ones that were predicted slightly wrong. NBC underlined that the people in these states were mainly Trump supporters, and that there were also people that tended to distrust institutions, which actually explain why these states haven't responded so well to the polls. On this account, NBC also interviewed the people from the National Security Law to speak about Trump's filing lawsuits. And what came out from their interviews was that despite there was no evidence of corruption, even if there were to be found, this would very, very unlikely change the outcome of the election. Switching to CNN, according to the Washington Post, John King, which is their leading data journalist, had a blast on the election night. In fact, he transformed a very intense situation into a fun one, which was actually disturbing for many of the viewers, as he looked the only one which was having fun in such a vulnerable and delicate moment. It was also stated by some of the other media that the CNN's map system kept changing colors of the states before there was a concrete decision made in them. In fact, a newspaper declared, "Uncertainty was the correct message to communicate, but CNN decided that flipping back and forth from red to blue was more exciting." If this confusion was actually intended or not, we don't know, but certainly it could have been a strategy. Also, CNN's journalist Wolf Blitzer was the first to announce the actual victory of Joe Biden at 11:24 a.m. on Saturday, which suggested they had really fast and good deep communication. This actually led the viewers to increase by 36% just 6 minutes after the announcement. But of how many viewers are we talking about? So during the election night, CNN reached over 9 million of viewers, being just behind Fox News for viewership ranking that was able to exceed 14 million of viewers that night. However, CNN was eventually able to top the total numbers of viewers for the week, maybe also because of their win in announcing the election results, averaging around 5.9 million of viewers. However, why was Fox News able to reach such a huge number of viewers? What's their secret? So according to the press, the total viewership of Fox News increased by 16% compared to 2016, with a much greater number of live streams. This was maybe a result of Fox News channel's free coverage for the whole population. But now let's come to more interesting things. Because the channel that kickstarted Donald Trump's political career, as we all know, Fox News, was suddenly in the position of making it end due to their early call of Arizona for Biden. In fact, Fox News decided far in advance, 1 million of votes had still to be counted, to announce Trump's loss for Arizona, which actually infuriated Mr. Trump and his aides, because for Trump, Fox News call for Mr. Biden's carried a lot of symbolism. What I mean is that Arizona appeared to be the first state to have completely changed direction from 2016, being the first real evidence of the drop in the number of people that were originally Trump supporters. This could also have meant a possible election loss for the president. In fact, Fox News' attitude was a bit peculiar compared to the general expectations. Despite they have been the only major cable network to carry the president's lawyer press conference, Rudy Giuliani, on the elections fraud, at a certain point, the channel promptly cut it away to announce instead a projected win for Biden in Michigan. Moreover, after the network's chief political anchor emphasized that Mr. Trump's legal work could throw the race into doubt, Fox News editor said, "We haven't seen any evidence yet that there's anything wrong with it," which appears to be a huge statement from a network that was actually considered to have a major Republican lean. This attitude could explain Trump's word on Tuesday morning on Fox and Friends, the program. He said, "Fox has changed a lot." Somebody asked, "What's the biggest difference between now and 4 years ago?" And he answered, "Fox." Wow. So Fox News attitude makes a lot of questions arise. For example, what has changed between Mr. Trump and Fox in the recent years? Is their change in attitude a consequence of the assumption of Biden's likely win, or is it a consequence of something else? And also, could Fox News' change in behavior have had an impact on the election results? So I'll leave you with these questions and hoping you'll find an answer.
Very interesting topics, Julia. Well, as we all experienced, the past week has been a very intense one from a political perspective, possibly one of the most intense weeks in the history of presidential elections. Tensions were really high, provoking unusual reactions not only among the public following the election race from home, but also among the journalists in front of the camera. In this way, throughout the week, we had the chance to experience some very interesting and unexpected moments coming from America's top journalists. The media's reaction, a mix of disbelief and indignation, translated into a very rapid call for action. ABS, CBS, NBC, along with other minor networks, cut off Mr. Trump during his speech, abruptly interrupting the transmission by saying that as public informers, they couldn't allow such misinformation to be spread. Other networks, such as the Fox News and CNN, broadcasted Trump's entire press conference but challenged what he said immediately after. Murdoch's New York Post, which had endorsed Trump's re-election, accused him of making baseless election fraud claims, while CNN's fact-checker Daniel Dale said it had been the most dishonest speech Trump has ever given. In regard to CNN, although they did not interrupt the president and seemed as if they were remaining calm and professional, the following reactions of different journalists proved the opposite. CNN's anchors were harsh, with Jake Tapper labeling the president's reaction as pathetic and Dana Bash calling him dangerous and nonsensical. However, out of everyone, it was Anderson Cooper that delivered the most shocking statement that night. Indeed, as a commentary to the president's speech, he said, "That is the President of the United States. That is the most powerful person in the world. We see him like an obese turtle on his back, flaying in the hot sun, realizing his time is over." Wow. Not exactly the statement that the public was expecting from one of America's top journalists. He later apologized for his body shaming of the presidents. As the race and its broadcast proceeded in the following days, many things were said, often not very reassuring for the people in front of the TV. On Saturday night, however, after days of uncertainty, anxiety, and high hopes, with the news of Joe Biden being elected as the 46th President of the United States, CNN's audience was provided with a very touching moment. Indeed, after the announcement of Biden's victory, opinionist and former Obama advisor Van Jones broke down into tears of joy, stating, "It's easier to be a parent this morning. It's easier to be a dad. It's easier to tell your kids. Character matters. Telling the truth matters. Being a good person matters." And went on to talk about what his news meant for Muslims, immigrants, and dreamers. Now, I will highlight some interesting reactions to Biden's win in different states and cities covered extensively by the media. One of the most exciting celebrations is covered by The Guardian. It was the one that took place on Saturday night outside of the White House in Washington, D.C. We have seen lots of pictures and videos of crowds of people dancing, drinking, and singing, holding U.S. flags, and of course wearing their masks, while cars were driving by honking their horns in celebration. Some interesting remarks were, "By dawn, you are fired, and we're going to be partying all night." Another significant celebration that took place in DC was that one at the Black Lives Matter Plaza. Most Americans seemed to be quite relieved by Biden's victory, pumping their fists in the air and crying, stating, "Trump really divided the country." The New York Times reported the situation in Washington Square Park, Manhattan, New York. Pro-Biden gatherings turned into huge dancing parties after the announcement of the election result. ABC News covered the Empire State Building's red, white, and blue illumination in celebration of Biden's victory, in addition to the crowds in Times Square and other supporters cheering and banging kitchenware from balconies and rooftops following the election result. On the other hand, after the final results of the presidential election, supporters of President Donald Trump went to the streets to protest, continuing to chant, "It's not over," and "Stop the steal," refusing to accept the defeat and fueling accusations that the Democrats won by deceiving. As written by The Guardian, just as Trump has refused to accept the outcome, so did around 70 million people who voted for him. In the capitals of the states across the country, particularly in the swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia. Crowds of varying sizes denounced the corruption of Biden's victory after more than 3 days of suspense leading up to his final election. They gathered at the so-called Stop the Steal rallies, which contrasted to the joyful celebration of Biden's victory that in comparison achieved greater participation. Moreover, the posts spread on social media demonstrated similar events in major American cities, and Facebook even banned a Stop the Steal group that engaged in violence. Despite the fact that many of the protesters carried arms openly, no immediate violence was reported. However, at one point, police intervention seemed necessary to separate Republican supporters from their opponents. For example, in Oregon, more than 300 people, many members of the far-right Proud Boys, were armed with rifles and continued to claim that as for many, it is their first time voting by email. They wanted to make sure everything is checked before there is an official winner. In Phoenix, 100 Trump supporters gathered for 3 consecutive days in front of the Phoenix Electoral Center, where many people were processing and counting the ballots, shouting at conspiracy theories. Some treasurers have even had to close their offices for fear of threats. The protests were also noticeable in Philadelphia, the capital of Pennsylvania, where some of the protesters said that legal votes matter and stated to some Washington Post interviewers, "When the count is fair and legal, Donald Trump will have won by a landslide, and you can't bank on that." And of course, something that we can easily anticipate. The protesters claimed that the rallies didn't end there, as they plan to hold protests over the next few days. Let's wait to see what's going to happen really soon.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Julia. Very good job. We'll now move to what has been actually this week's election across social media. I will now call the intervention of Esther from Team New Media. She will give a general understanding of what has been through this week that has seen social media really active, especially for President Trump's frequent tirades on Twitter.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm gonna talk about the reaction of Donald Trump on Twitter and other Republicans on social media. So when the TV networks called the election in favor of Joe Biden, the Republican Donald Trump was unable to accept the result gracefully, as many people anticipated. The former US president, in fact, used Twitter in order to complain. In his first tweet after losing the election, Trump posted in full caps, "The observers were not allowed into the counting rooms. I won the election. I got 71 million legal votes. Bad things happened, which our observers were not allowed to see. Never happened before. Millions of mail-in ballots were sent to people who never asked from them." Fortunately, the tweet and many others from town were flagged by Twitter in order to avoid the spread of misinformation. Trump has also attempted to cast doubt on the election result by sharing an election conspiracy theory from far-right news website. The story is based on claims that software errors had caused votes to be incorrectly counted, claims that have been widely discounted. As a result of Trump's tweets in the capital of Pennsylvania, the state that ultimately tipped the election in favor of the president-elect Joe Biden, supporters of the president Donald Trump gathered to protest the election result this weekend. His supporters gathered under the banner "Stop the Steal," convinced that the election had been stolen. Many people were interviewed by CNN, and one woman even said that she had seen evidence that the election had been rigged by referring to a video footage. But the video she was talking about as an evidence is not real. It has been circulating on social media for days, even being retweeted by Eric Trump, the president's son. But the video does not show Trump ballots being burned, as some have claimed. Election officials in Virginia have in fact explained that they were simple ballots. They have been trying to correct the viral misinformation for days now. Trump supporter use of false information in this way is not unique. It is not a one-off. Other protesters say that a sudden change in an urban result map in favor of Biden on election night in Michigan could be an evidence of the stolen election. Trump had amplified the claim himself on his Twitter account, but that too has been shown to be misinformation and fake news. The use of false information didn't start with Stop the Steal. Trump and some of his supporters have weaponized misinformation through the election campaign. CNN has previously shown how the passively edited videos of Biden had contributed to some of Trump supporters' belief that Biden was not a fair fit for the office. The president himself is allies as Fox News personalities embrace misinformation. Sometimes Trump will retweet a post with false claim that is already going viral, and other times Trump will create his own misinformation by posting false claims. Trump and his followers have used misinformation as evidence to prove the validity of more misinformation. Social media here serve as an engine for misinformation to spread, but the labels used by Twitter and Facebook won't convince Trump supporters who have already embraced conspiracy theories about the election. And the main point here is the fact that by criticizing the outcome of the election and spreading fake news and misinformation, Trump is not criticizing Joe Biden himself, but the democracy itself and the system that elected him 4 years ago.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you for your intervention and your good job. We will now move to our final theme of the episode. Team US Affairs with Alex and Rebecca actually will help us guide into what has been the main key races for the Senate, where the situation is still unclear because we will have 2 runoff elections on January 5th. But I'll give the floor now to Alex and Rebecca, who will help us to have a better understanding of what to expect in the upcoming weeks.
Thank you, Ennio. So, Rebecca, do we have any news on what happened in the Senate after Joe Biden has been announced as the president-elect?
Yes, the Senate is still in control of the Republican Party with a virtual lead of 50 seats to 48, and the final 2 seats will be decided into runoff in Georgia on January 5th. And Democrats have not been able to take control of the chamber, while Republicans have still to fight in the upcoming weeks to be sure to control the majority that they actually held since 2015. And please remember that in case of a 50-50 tie, the vice president has the power to break a tie and cast a deciding vote if it is necessary.
And so, who is the new Democratic senator for Arizona, one of the flip states regarding the Senate elections?
It is Mark Kelly. He defeated the Republican candidate Martha McSally and gained a seat that is crucial to Democrats' effort to wrest the control of the Senate.
I guess I've heard him, but certainly not in the field of politics. Am I confusing myself with someone else?
No, you're not. In fact, Mr. Kelly is a former astronaut, and he is also a retired Navy captain. And thanks to his outsider attitude, he built a strong national profile. And you may have heard him for his wife. His wife was a former Democrat representative. Her name was Gabrielle Giffords, and she was shot in an attempted murder in 2011 during a town hall with his constituents in Tucson. And this episode turned Kelly into a staunch advocate for gun control. And for the record, he leaned out into his biography on the campaign trail, playing up his work as a NASA space shuttle pilot, and he also present himself as an independent-minded moderator.
You have mentioned his main opponent, Ms. McSally. Who is she?
She is, first of all, she is the first woman to pilot an American warplane in combat, and she also sued the Russian administration for making her wear an abaya while on duty on Saudi Arabia. And last year, she spoke out powerfully about how she had been raped by a male superior officer. And though she clung tightly to the president, the feeling was not always mutual. In fact, Mr. Trump had repeatedly asked his advisor if her candidacy was adversely affecting his own prospect in Arizona, and at his campaign rallies in state, instead of bolstering Miss McSally, he sometimes tweeted with disdain. And in the final days of the race, during her rally in Goodyear, Mr. Trump told the candidate that she had only 1 minute to speak, and he also urged her to be very quick. And but now tell me, Alex, how is the situation in Colorado?
Well, even here we do have some interesting people. John Hickenlooper, two-term governor and the former mayor of Denver, defeated Senator Cory Gardner on Tuesday in the high-profile fight for the Colorado Senate seat, assuring a victory essential to Democrats' push to take the Senate majority. It was a widely expected gain for the Democrats, as for Mr. Kelly, but nothing is certain in politics. Due to his experience, he will add an experienced voice to Democrat Senate ranks, one with a background in Western energy and environmental issues. And after initially professing no interest in running for the Senate, he reconsidered after his 2019 bid in the Democrat presidential primary went nowhere.
But Mr. Gardner was his main opponent. Doesn't he have a strong relationship with Trump?
Yes, indeed. In 2016, Gardner called for Trump to quit the presidential race after a leaked audio emerged of him boasting of sexually assaulting women while recording an Access Hollywood episode. But after Trump was elected, Gardner became a strong supporter, and he was among the first to endorse him for re-election. As a result, the senator found himself constantly squeezed between independent and other voters who expected him to break with the president's more extreme positions, and those in the solidly conservative, though less populated areas of the state who supported Trump without questions and demanded that Gardner do the same. And any news for Alabama?
Well, in Alabama, where Trump has achieved the majority, the Republican Tommy Tuberville has regained the seat for the party. He is an athlete too, a former football coach and loyal to the former President Trump. And it must be noticed that his Democrat and moderate rival, Doug Jones, was the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent in the chamber, as he won a special election in 2017 against the Republican Roy S. Moore, who was accused of sexual abuse and also child molestation. Mr. Jones right now is one of the hottest names for a cabinet position in Biden administration because to his moderate profile.
And what about in Maine, where Joe Biden has won with 53.5% of the votes?
In Maine, most pundits were expecting a flip, but this has not happened. The Republican Susan Collins has been re-elected for a fifth term, and she is one of the few Republican senators who has recognized Joe Biden as the president-elected. And Mr. Biden has also congratulated with Ms. Collins on a win. And the most senior Republican woman in the Senate has held off a challenge from Sarah Gideon, the Democratic Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, who has her experience in working across the aisle, hoping to siphon some of Collins' support among moderate Democrats. But do you have any news on what is going on in Georgia?
Well, the traditionally Republican southern state is probably going to end up calling for Joe Biden. In 2016, Donald Trump won Georgia with 51% of the vote to Hillary Clinton's 46%. No Democratic candidate has won the state since Bill Clinton in 1992.
So how did Georgia turn blue? Obviously, as long as it survives a recount.
Well, in order to reply to your question, we need to recall the journey that Democrats have made over the last 100 years, from being the party of the farmland to a profoundly urban coalition. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson's support in rural America was higher than in support in urban counties. Now it looks like Biden won the election by running up score in cities and pushing the inner suburbs left, even as Trump strengthened his grip on rural areas. Highly educated populations concentrated in those urban areas tend to be Democratic, as we know. Hence, the transformation of Georgia, the state is home to Atlanta, one of the nation's most dynamic metropolises, which now accounts for 57% of Georgia's population. Atlanta has drawn in a growing number of college-educated workers, so that at this point, the percentage of working-age adults with a bachelor's degree is higher in Georgia than in Wisconsin and Michigan.
Okay, but then why did Biden win Georgia even as he was losing North Carolina, which is, we can say it is a well-educated state with growing knowledge industries?
Well, the capital density education is not always enough. Georgia had another ace in the hole, Stacey Abrams. She was the Democratic Party's nominee in 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election, becoming the first African-American female major party gubernatorial nominee in the United States. She narrowly lost to Brian Kemp for Georgia's gubernatorial election, but her loss clarified the fact that the demographic shifts in the suburbs had reached a tipping point. Democrats could win more races by expanding their coalition to include the disengaged voters of color, as opposed to continuing the focus on persuading undecided moderate, often white voters. Abrams had come close with the strategy. Her campaign and its allies registered more than 200,000 new voters in the run-up to 2018 election, when Fair Fight and New Georgia Project, two organizations founded by Abrams, tried against this year. They quadrupled their gains, registering more than 800,000 new voters, confirming that is an effective strategy. Do you think?
Yes, sure. And it seems that Stacey Abrams knew what she was doing. And thank you very much for the clarifications.
Same for me. Now let's leave the floor to Ennio and Prof. Quartarone.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Rebecca. We have now concluded our episode 6 of Good Night and Good Luck. Perhaps by the next week episodes, we will still be uncertain whether President Trump will concede or at least will acknowledge the results of the election. We still don't know. What we have seen is that more and more Republicans each day are starting to recognizing and accepting the actual result. But as we said in the earlier episode of this run, and we will say until the final episode scheduled for early December, always expect the unexpected.
Thank you, Ennio. That's all, folks. I have nothing particularly to add. As usual, I want to thank the newsroom, the group of 35 students that realized the program. And as usual, their talent, their passion, their commitment. And I want to thank Radio Bocconi and Bocconi Arts and Humanities Committee for their collaboration and support. For the moment, take care, stay safe, good night, and good luck.